We're being gaslit about generational wealth, especially, I think, as single women, because generational wealth is not just about money, okay? It's not just about what money families inherit, it's about what communities pass down. And actually, for single women, we may need an entirely different definition of legacy. Now, the first thing I want to say here, because I think this is so important, systems of power and society more generally has linked womanhood and the definition of womanhood to procreation, i.e., becoming somebody's mother, and to marriage to a man specifically, i.e., becoming a man's wife. Okay. And so what happens is that when you are a single woman who either by choice or circumstance, okay, is not a mother, is not married, there is often this, sometimes it's an outright statement, actually, it's not an implication or insinuation, that you do not have a legacy. And we need to be very clear here that there's a difference between lineage and legacy. Lineage is just actually the continuation of your DNA. That's all it is. When people have children, that is lineage. That is not automatic legacy. And it doesn't actually speak to, quite frankly, whether or not that's a legacy that is having a positive impact and a legacy that we are proud of. And so as single women, do not allow yourself to be gaslit into believing that you do not have a legacy because you do not have children, if that's the case, and because you're not married. And what we're going to explore in this video is what generational wealth really is, in my view, and the fact that it's not simply about money. It's not simply about money. If these slides would behave. So like I said, for women who are child-free, generational wealth does not disappear. Okay, it just takes a different shape. And you know what? You can go and research. There are a number of individuals in the world who are respected, revered, and valued because of the impact their work had on community and society. And they were not mothers, nor were they somebody's wife. Okay, and so we can choose as women, as single women in particular, to think about legacy in a very different way. It does not require us to continue our DNA through biological procreation. Now, obviously, the traditional model of generational wealth is about building wealth and leaving it to children. All right. Now, I actually believe that you can still build wealth, and we'll talk about what wealth actually means because there are multiple elements to it. I see it all the time in the comments. Sometimes people will say health is wealth, right? So there's different aspects and facets of wealth. Okay. But actually for a single woman, you can build wealth and then direct it intentionally. Yeah. Direct it intentionally. And that direction does not have to be through having children of your own. There we go. Wonderful. All right. So it's a different model when it comes to generational wealth entirely. Also, I don't think generational wealth starts with money, and I've always held this view. Okay, a lot of the time you'll have certain communities very obsessed about generational wealth. It's almost become this marker of success. One, do you know what it is? Two, are you working towards it? What are you leaving to children? But actually, I think money specifically is the final chapter in a much longer story about generational wealth, right? And look, I acknowledge that different histories, different communities will have different relationships with money on a systemic level, because that is true and real. I just saw Vivian too, your finance BFF. I think that's the tag, but she did a video that went viral over the last week or so, where she talked about this myth about Asian Americans all being wealthy, essentially. And she gave some history there, some of which you might well be aware of, in terms of the way different communities have been socialized systemically around money, and how access is impacted, how different communities are perceived, okay, and how different communities in reality interact with money, ownership, and wealth. And it's actually quite funny because I then saw another video from a young salesman. He is based in the UK, but he talked about the fact that he sells to different communities in different ways. And he broke down what that actually looks like. So, for example, he said that when he's selling to Black people, and he was this frank, he will mention things like generational wealth and passive income. And that video was very well received, actually. He thought it would be quite controversial. He broke down selling to Indians, selling to East Asians, selling to white families, because different histories and communities have been socialized around money differently. And this is why I really wanted to talk about this, because generational wealth has become a bit of a buzzword more broadly. And actually, I do think that there are nuances to this, especially if you are a single woman, because generational wealth, as I say, is linked to lineage, but it is not the same as legacy. But also, we often miss the fact that it starts somewhere. And I would argue that for single women who have, by choice, opted out of having children because they don't want them, okay, they don't want to be a parent, or there are other factors in their childhood and history that have led them to a place where they think to themselves, actually, I do not want to perpetuate certain patterns, certain behaviors, etc. We are in a fantastic position, okay, not only to preserve our health, our physical health, but also to build wealth, whatever that means to us, because actually we're doing it often free of certain shackles. That doesn't mean that we are not impacted by broader economy and the way financial institutions are set up. As you know, I talk every single week about the single woman economy and the fact that actually it was not designed for single economic actors, and it certainly wasn't designed for the volume of women being economic actors, okay? But what I am saying is that depending on the way you look at generational wealth, certainly for me, my thing is, for example, if somebody's having multiple children with multiple people that they don't know, like, and trust, you are not building generational wealth. In fact, you thwart your financial chances of doing that. And that is something that we don't discuss enough, because financial wealth specifically is downstream of infrastructure. Okay, the finances is often the last thing. It's the final expression. But if you are living a lifestyle or making repeated choices around, as I say, having children, because that's the most glaringly obvious one, okay? If you are having children with multiple people where you're scrambling, okay, to get child support from them, one, and in the US, this is an acute circumstance, right? There are other places in the world that even if they do have a child support system, it is not enforced in the same way that the US will enforce it. And the impact on people is slightly different, right? And so that is going to thwart your financial life, period. There are some men, for example, that have got, 2-3 kids with different women, and they are under the cosh every single month. Their salary is being split 6-7 ways before it even hits their pay packet, right? This is a big issue. Okay. And so in the same breath, I hear these types of people talking about generational wealth and the importance, but the decisions that they're making, lifestyle decisions, are thwarting any of those attempts, because it's very difficult to build generational wealth, much less maintain and pass on, when your lineage is scattered. And the same goes for women. This is one of the reasons why I talk so openly about the fact that as a young woman in particular, okay, when I say young, I'm still referring to anything up to kind of 45, where you have the ability to procreate. Okay, as a woman, you do have to think about procreation and reproduction as a financial decision. It is not just an emotional decision, because it costs money to raise children in the world that we're living in. And actually, the cost of living continues to increase. Now, I am by no stretch saying that you should not have children, you should not desire to have children. We have a whole episode coming out about the economics of solo motherhood, because many single women are choosing to have children by themselves from inception. So I'm not saying that the desire itself is unhealthy, inappropriate, or wrong. What I am saying is that the reality is it is also a financial decision. And so that's why I speak so frankly to young women about the things that you need to be aware of before you reproduce. Okay, because if you are thinking about generational wealth, who you have children with really matters here. Their attitude around money, what they think about money. You know, if you have children with a man that thinks it's acceptable to nickel and dime you on giving you money for your child's, you know, for providing for your children. I mean, more broadly, I find this to be, I'm so relieved that I've made certain life decisions for myself, because it is very easy, it is extraordinarily easy as a woman to end up in a situation where you've had children or a child with somebody that you can't co-parent with in peace, but also you are always having to, in the US, it's that they go back to court, ask for more money. They're asking for financial documents to be shared with them all the time. Like it's a type of palaver and dysfunction that I am incredibly relieved and grateful that's not my norm. Okay. And it's so important as young women in particular, or if you still have the biological ability to reproduce, do not lose your senses, because it is a financial decision. And if you are someone who's thinking about generational wealth, as it were, these things impact your ability to build the wealth, maintain the wealth, and then of course pass it down to whoever you may want to pass it down to. All right. And so as families, we pass down more than just money. Okay, there's financial, so it could be assets, property, businesses, pensions, inheritance. But there's also intellectual, educational wealth, financial literacy, networks, the critical thinking. Okay, then there's psychological wealth, in my view, emotional regulation, delayed gratification, self-worth. That is a big one for women. All right. And actually is deeply, it influences how we even see money, how we interact with money as adults and as women. Okay. And a lot of women, that has not been passed down to them. A deep sense of self-worth and value, that hasn't been passed down. And if that isn't passed down, of course, we're going to find other things around money very difficult, because essentially that's a receiving muscle. Yeah, money is about choices. Money creates choices, options, leverage, opportunities. And if we don't value ourselves, if we do not feel inherently worthy, then we will, through our behavior, reject receiving. And that includes receiving money and having money. This is one of the reasons why, if you think about it, there are lots of, it's well studied and documented, lots of lottery winners. Okay, they win money and they spend it very quickly. That isn't because of always a lack of financial literacy. It's not because they could not have gotten a financial advisor. Often there are deeper rooted reasons deep in their nervous system and consciousness about what that money represents, how they see themselves in relation to that money. And you can look up exactly what they've spent the money on. And by the way, it's not always that they're spending it on frivolous items. Sometimes they've given the money away. And there's a question around, why do you feel compelled to give money away instead of holding it? Okay, there's lots of people for whom they've grown up in environments with parents, for example, who never ever kept any money. They were always giving money away, or they've grown up feeling guilty about having money. And so that follows through in their behavior as an adult when it comes to the way they interact with money. Okay, then you've got relational wealth, stable systems, trustworthy adults, mentorship, community. That is something that families pass down that directly impacts the way we interact with money, the way we see money, whether or not we can accumulate money and keep it. And then we have health, like I said, physical health, mental health, nervous system health, care access. I would argue that those last four are often the foundation. They're the infrastructure that then helps you to accumulate money, like as in tangible money and financial wealth, and accumulate surplus, accumulate abundance, be able to maintain abundance. You know, when you speak to a lot of people who have become wealthy, especially if they didn't come from wealth, they were not born into wealth, they will share a myriad of experiences, but one of the things that they sometimes will say is that actually they fear losing the money. You see, you get some people who are savers, they never spend, they're very frugal, but actually there's a deep fear that they will lose their money, that one day they won't have money. And so they find it difficult to spend. By the way, that can be true of people who have no money, people who may regard themselves as impoverished or broke, right? They also can be very frugal, i.e. not like to spend at all. Like, it's actually not about how much money exactly is in your bank account. It really is about your nervous system's capacity to hold wealth. And also, to a certain extent, to be quite neutral about money in general. Can you still function regardless of the money that's in your bank account? Do you still feel worthy regardless of the money that's in your bank account? These are things that families pass down above and beyond the actual money. And I think the problem is we live in a society that isn't really focused on passing down intellectual wealth, psychological wealth, relational wealth, and health wealth. It's always focused on money. And like I say, there are broader systemic reasons as to why certain communities have this type of relationship with money and why it matters for status, etc. And when you think about women in particular, women have been excluded from financial services since the beginning of time. It's only been about 50, 55 years since women could have their own bank account, their own bank account, sign for their own loans, and own their own property. So you have to think about the impact that can have on women. And so you may have a drive to accumulate financial wealth, for example. Or you might be somebody who's afraid of money. You haven't worked on your relationship with money yet. And so sometimes you doubt your right to have money. You may feel guilty. We were in our small group training session this week, and one of the participants said that she feels guilt that she has the resources to have a housekeeper, to have a cleaner, etc. And one of the things she said was it's because that she manages her resources in a certain way. And what we explored is that you do not have to justify and rationalize why you have the resources in the first place. It doesn't mean you're better, worse, or different. It just is what it is. And so it's very important for us as single women to realize that legacy is more than just lineage. In fact, it has nothing to do with lineage in many cases. And secondly, generational wealth can encompass more than just the money, more than just the money itself. Okay? And the fact of the matter is, you might be thinking about the fact that maybe you haven't inherited financial wealth from your family, but some people inherit trauma. And some people inherit both. But these patterns still compound the way interest compounds, right? And so it's totally okay for you maybe not to even be interested in accumulating wealth. You could absolutely be a woman who is thinking, do you know what, I just want to get by. Now, I will be very honest with you. I always believe, particularly single women, you should have more money than you need. That doesn't mean that you need to be a billionaire or a millionaire or wealthy, as it were. It does mean, though, that my recommendation, and this is something that I live by myself, it is always important to have more than you need so that you are well resourced and you're not in survival mode. You want to be in a certain level of abundance for long enough so that your nervous system gets used to holding that amount of support. Because remember, the money is just a symbol. Okay? It symbolizes options, choices, leverage, opportunity, always. And so it is important for women, particularly single women, because you are not living in a traditional setting whereby maybe there's a second income coming from somebody else. All right. And so it's very important to be thinking about that. I don't do the bare bones living just because you're single. And that, by the way, doesn't mean that you might be someone who likes to live a quiet life. There's a brilliant TikTok account that comes up on my feed sometimes. It's a single woman. I think she's in her late 30s. She's a cleaner. She documents her whole day. She gets up in the morning, goes to her cleaning job. I think she's there for about 5:30, cleans. Then she's home in the late afternoon. She's got a dog at home. She eats what she wants. The house is clean. The house is quiet. I'm not saying that you have to be living a luxurious life. I'm not saying that your life you need to even aspire and esteem to certain lifestyles that are often presented to us online. Yachts, All of that's unnecessary. I'm not saying that. You could quite simply enjoy living a quiet life. I lived a nomadic life for quite a few years, actually. And at one point in my apartment, I had very little furniture. I get a lot of comments about this setup. This is very me, right? I will have one sofa, my desk, my laptop, and a desk chair. I've lived like that for years. And actually, sometimes for me, the more furniture or things that I see in my line of sight, the less focused I feel. Like I don't like seeing unnecessary items. I don't like clutter, and I will regularly and periodically, I am known for giving things away and recycling things and giving things to charity, like regularly, because as far as I'm concerned, if I'm not using it on a day-to-day basis, I don't need it, right? I do not like accumulating material items. But I can also acknowledge that a lot of that is steeped in experiences I've had in the past. I don't like feeling weighted down. I don't like seeing what I regard as waste. And on the other hand, by the way, when I do give things away to charity, let's say 3 years later, I do want a bike, I'll buy one without hesitation, right? I will buy things that I want and buy things I need, even if I had it 5 years ago. But one thing about me is I'm not going to keep the thing for 8 years, never use it just in case, right? So everybody has a different relationship with money and a different relationship with themselves and the lifestyle that they want. But it is important to realize that generational wealth is more than just money. And in many ways, if you are someone who can save appropriately, you are somebody who will spend money on yourself, that is a type of generational wealth. We do not always have to be thinking about money as women, but particularly as single women, in relation to who we are giving it to, who it could serve better. It is completely fine for money to serve you, to give you the things that you want. You do not have to justify. You don't have to be altruistic, charitable. And that's another thing that women get into. Yeah. This is why I always challenge the concept of generational wealth, because as far as I'm concerned, I opted out of having children for a reason. And therefore, I'm not going to think about imaginary children when it comes to money. For me personally, I'm thinking about myself. In 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 40 years' time, what do I want my day-to-day life to feel like? And what do I want my lifestyle to be? And how much is that going to cost? Right? A lot of single women, because of fear, have not sat down and literally listed out everything that they would want to have, buy, services they'd want to use in 20 years' time, 30 years' time. Now, of course, inflation is a thing. Yes, things might adjust, but that doesn't mean that that exercise is futile. I actually sat down many years ago and literally listed out, what do I want on a month-to-month basis? Do I want to be able to buy a coffee every single day, for example? Do I want to travel once a quarter? Do I want to travel every month? What kind of saucepans do I want on my stove? You might think that these are trivial, mundane things. They are not. I would highly encourage you to sit down and make a list. Make a list of all the things that you want, the services you might need. If you're somebody who wants to get your hair done, you want to have pedicures, maybe you want a car. Do you want a cleaner? Get clear on the list of things that you want to have and get clear on the number. And that isn't meant to scare you. But in actual fact, sometimes it can be liberating and freeing, because you actually might need less than you are imagining that you need. And then, as you know, I will always say, top it up. Put a little bit extra on there so that you can have things that you want, so that as you age, and if you are single by choice or circumstance, you are not having to live on the breadline. You are not having to live on the breadline. There is no reward for living on the breadline as a woman. And women have been taught to do without and make do. No. That is the type of generational wealth thinking we want to think about, right? The generations that exist within you and your lifetime, not the DNA and lineage part. But actually, the way I see it is I will keep evolving as the years go on. So there'll be a new era, as it were, of Ashanti in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. That's the generational future I'm looking at. That's the generational future I'm looking at. So what does wealth mean to me? What does it mean to you? But get your actual number clear, because clarity allows, money loves clarity. Anyway, Okay, money loves clarity. So you should know what your number is. And yes, that might change. In 5 years' time, you might change your mind. One of the things that's changed for me at the moment is that I always had the intention of buying multiple properties. I simply don't feel that way anymore. I know, right, I want to build a house in Jamaica and I want to be able to retire to Jamaica during the winter months when I'm in my 60s and beyond. So, yes, that requires me to accumulate the funds and the wealth to build a house in Jamaica. But outside of that, I do not have a desire to accumulate countless properties because it's a good asset class. That's a personal decision. I've thought about lifestyle, I've thought about what I am bothered to manage. It's going to be different for you, but it's important for you to start thinking about that as a single woman. Just because you don't have children, if you happen to be child free, it doesn't mean that these things are futile exercises. And it doesn't mean that the conversation about generational wealth doesn't apply to us. Because money is not the only thing that compounds. Scarcity thinking does, financial anxiety, instability, distrust of institutions, which is a whole thing, right? But actually, so does long-term planning. Maybe entrepreneurship on whatever level you choose to engage in that with. Being emotionally regulated, feeling truly at peace and content and joyful in your life, that compounds. That is just as important as accumulating wealth to pass on to other people, right? And as I say, I don't think certain communities think enough about those things when they are on one hand gabbing about generational wealth and on the other hand, certain lifestyle choices are thwarting those attempts from the get-go. Right? Because your money amplifies infrastructure. This is why I'm thinking about my infrastructure. At 37 years old, I'm thinking about in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, what infrastructure do I want to have in place? What foundation must exist? And then what money is needed to amplify that, to support that, not the other way around. Okay, because you could end up building a life that you didn't really want in the first place because other people are doing it. And this is why I'm saying a lot of generational wealth conversation is usually seated in the context of having a partner and having children to pass that money on to. If you're a single child-free woman, it's not the same. Now, what I will say, of course, you may have siblings, you may have nieces and nephews, you may have parents, but you're not necessarily passing the wealth backwards, right? So you get to decide. You may want to allocate funds to nieces and nephews. You may have, children that you're very fond of, close to. I know that in some cultures they have things called godparents. There's all sorts. I'm not saying that because you haven't given birth to your own children, there isn't a younger generation that you may want to, provide for. What I am saying though is you get to choose. Yeah, the rules don't apply. The rules simply do not apply. So when we look at wealthy families, they inherit worlds, not just bank accounts. So that is what we need to be focused on. And as a single woman, you can create your own world. You can have your own networks. You can become more confident about money. You too can access. And again, don't think about this in the big sense. A lot of people, when they think of billionaires, when they think of wealth, they think of billionaires who they believe to be corrupt. They think of It doesn't have to be that. You can create your own economy. When I talk about the single woman economy, I'm talking about you creating your own economy. Right? You can create your own world to inhabit and to live in on your own terms. On your own terms. You can tell I'm terrible at following a slide deck, but I needed to structure my thoughts because I thought it might be easier for you to follow along. But it's so important that, we continue to talk about these things, the invisible contracts around money and self-determination and work as single women, and look at things for what they are, not what we're being taught that they are. And I think generational wealth is definitely one of those conversations that I find, it's very outdated. And quite frankly, doesn't apply to the fact that, 41% of adults are single in certain countries. And that probably is going to continue to grow. So what does that mean in the overall context of generational wealth? So in the description somewhere, there is an invisible contract audit workbook, and that allows you to look at the invisible contracts that might be governing your life in your own private reflection time. Grab your copy of that. And like I say, this is the stuff that obviously I talk about on this channel. So do subscribe if you're interested in hearing more about the single woman economy.